At the base of Mount Fuji, the earth does not breathe. It is a sprawling expanse of volcanic rock and ancient timber known as Aokigahara.
The locals call it the Sea of Trees, a name that masks a more jagged reality. Here, the ground swallows sound. The air holds the weight of 1,000 secrets,
pressing down on the canopy until the wind itself seems to die upon contact. Compasses spin in useless circles, needles swinging wildly against the magnetic pull of the earth.
This is a place where direction loses its meaning. The silence is not merely an absence of noise, it is a physical barrier that separates the forest from the living world.
The trees grow in tight, suffocating clusters, their roots twisting over jagged basalt in a permanent, locked grip. There are no birds.
There is no rustle of wildlife, only the damp, heavy scent of decaying wood and the unsettling certainty that the forest is watching.
It has stood for centuries, unmoved by the passage of time, a geological tomb waiting for the unwary to step off the path. Once inside, the horizon vanishes.
The light fades into a perpetual, bruised twilight, and the path behind you simply ceases to exist.
October 2025. The perimeter of the forest looked like a jagged wound against the clear sky. A van pulled onto the gravel shoulder, and 4 figures emerged: Daniel, Emma, Ryan, and Lucas. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a professional documentary crew, unloading crates of recording gear, external microphones, and high-gain antennas. Their equipment was pristine, all matte black metal and blinking LED lights, a stark, synthetic contrast to the ancient, moss-choked chaos of the trees. Daniel checked his watch, the metal strap clicking against his wrist, while Ryan adjusted a heavy boom pole. Emma stood near the tree line, her gaze fixed on the dark, impenetrable wall of timber. They were here for one reason: to chase the impossible. For months, hikers had reported voices in the static, rhythmic sounds that defied natural explanation. The team intended to capture it, to categorize the phenomena, and to leave before the sun hit the horizon again. They hauled their gear toward the trailhead, their boots crunching loudly on the volcanic scree. They were outsiders, bringing their own rules into a place that had never cared for them. Daniel signaled for them to move. One by one, they stepped past the warning signs, crossing the threshold from the known world into the quiet, waiting gloom of the Sea of Trees. The transition was immediate. As their boots hit the soft, needle-strewn forest floor, the world changed.
The ambient noise of the outside, the wind, the distant road, the rustle of leaves simply vanished.
It was as if a heavy curtain had been drawn shut behind them. Daniel led the way,
his steps muffled by the thick layer of decay that covered the volcanic rock. He paused, raising a hand to signal a halt, but there was nothing to hear.
No birds called from the canopy. No insects hummed in the undergrowth. The air felt static, trapped between the ancient trunks that loomed on every side. Emma adjusted her headphones,
searching for a baseline hum, but the silence was absolute. It was a vacuum of sound that made the blood pulse in their ears.
They stood in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches locking together like fingers. Every time one of them shifted their weight, the sound was unnaturally loud, a sharp intrusion into a void that did not want to be disturbed. Ryan looked up at the canopy.
But the leaves hung motionless, frozen in place. The forest was not merely quiet, it was holding its breath.
They were no longer just observers. They were guests in a space that felt increasingly aware of their presence. Emma knelt, setting the digital recorder on a flat, moss-covered stone. She plugged her headphones in, the cord snaking across the damp ground. Daniel watched her, his face lit by the dim glow of the equipment screen. Around them, the forest remained a tomb. No breeze stirred the needles. No animal broke the silence. Emma frowned, sliding the volume dial up. Her eyes widened. She tapped the recorder, then adjusted the gain.
"Listen," she whispered. Passing the headphones to Daniel, he pressed them against his ears.
At first, there was only the hiss of white noise, the sound of the machine itself. Then, beneath the static, a rhythmic pulse emerged. It was a faint, layered sound, like a dozen voices speaking in a single, overlapping tone. Daniel pulled the headphones away, his brow furrowed. He checked the cables, then the mic input. Everything was connected correctly. He put the headphones back on. The voice was clearer now, thin and cold,
repeating a single phrase. "Don't follow him!" The words cut through the dead air of the clearing with impossible precision.
Daniel looked at the others, his expression tight. There was no one else within miles, yet the recording held a warning that sounded like it had been spoken inches from the microphone. The sky above the canopy turned a bruised, deep purple as dusk pressed in. Daniel pulled his GPS unit from his pocket to check their coordinates, but the screen remained a flat, dead gray. He shook it, tapped the side, and held it up to the fading light. Nothing. Beside him, Lucas checked his own device, then shook his head. The satellite signal had dropped to 0 without warning.
A cold wind finally stirred, but it did not carry the scent of rain. It smelled of damp earth and rot.
Ryan reached out to grab a strip of bright orange marking tape he had tied to a trunk only an hour before. His fingers closed on nothing but rough bark. He moved to the next tree, then the one after that. The tape was gone. He circled back, scanning the ground, but there were no scraps, no knots, no sign that they had ever been there. The forest floor was pristine, devoid of their passage. Daniel stood in the center of the path, his compass needle spinning in a frantic, erratic circle. The trail they had followed now seemed to fork into identical, narrow gaps in the brush. The markers that ensured their return had been erased, leaving them with no anchor to the world they had left behind.
Ryan stopped abruptly, his hand hovering over the grip of his flashlight. He spun around,
shining the beam into the dense, black wall of trees behind them. Nothing moved. He turned back, his face tight.
"Someone is pacing us!" he snapped, his voice cracking against the stillness. Daniel stepped forward,
blocking Ryan's path. "It is just the acoustics of the valley, Ryan. We are turned around, not hunted."
Emma stood between them, her hands trembling as she adjusted the audio levels, the playback still cycling through the same static.
"We are not just lost," Ryan countered, his gaze darting between the trees.
"The tape didn't just fall off. Something took it. Something is waiting for us to stop," Daniel laughed.
But the sound lacked any conviction. He shoved his hands into his pockets, pacing the narrow space of the clearing.
"You are spiraling. We follow the topography. We find the ridge. We head out." Ryan shook his head,
refusing to meet Daniel's eyes. The air between them grew heavy, the professional distance of the crew replaced by a sharp,
jagged edge of suspicion. Every rustle of a leaf, every creak of a branch now felt like a deliberate movement, and as they argued, the forest seemed to lean in closer, listening to the discord.
The argument died as a sudden gust of wind tore through the clearing, stripping leaves from the branches.
It did not just move the air, it cleared a dense thicket of ferns that had appeared solid moments before.
Revealed behind the brush was a narrow, winding trail. It was not a hiker's path, but a deep, sunken groove in the earth.
Barely wide enough for one person to walk through. The ground looked soft, almost bruised.
And it led directly into the heart of the deepest, darkest density of the woods. Emma stepped toward it,
her eyes fixed on the path as if it were pulling her forward. "Look at the light," she whispered. The light ahead was not the gray of dusk,
but a strange, sickly violet glow that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. Daniel stood at the mouth of the trail, his boots hovering at the threshold. He looked back at the way they had come.
But the forest behind them had already shifted, the trees closing ranks to hide their previous route.
There was no way to return. Ryan followed Emma, his hand brushing against the rough, moss-covered timber at the trail's edge. He did not look back. One by one, they stepped onto the narrow path. As the last of them crossed the threshold,
the branches above them interlaced, weaving into a solid, impenetrable ceiling that blotted out the sky.
the narrow path ended as abruptly as it had begun, depositing them into a circular clearing choked with dead ferns. The air here was colder, biting at their skin. Near the center, a tent slumped against the roots of a massive, twisted cedar. It was a skeletal ruin of nylon and aluminum, the fabric bleached by years of exposure. Daniel brushed aside a curtain of rot, revealing the interior. A rusted lantern sat on the ground, its glass shattered. Next to it, a metal canteen lay half buried in the leaf litter. Lucas stepped forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He reached down to pick up a small, leather-bound notebook, but the moment his fingers brushed the cover, the material crumbled into gray flakes. It was as if the forest had been slowly digesting the site for over a decade. Nothing had been packed, nothing had been cleared. They found a sleeping bag partially unzipped, as though the occupant had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Emma circled the perimeter, her boots crunching on something hard. She knelt and cleared away a thick layer of pine needles to reveal a tripod, its metal joints seized with rust. They stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the remnants of a life interrupted, the silence of the campsite pressing against them with the weight of an unwritten ending. Daniel reached into the tent and pulled out a heavy, rectangular object wrapped in a decaying plastic bag. It was a camcorder. The surface was gritty with layers of trapped soil, and the battery compartment was fused shut. He used his pocket knife to pry the latch, the metal screeching in the quiet clearing. A small green light flickered, then died. He tried again, pressing his thumb hard against the power button. The device groaned, then hummed to life. The crew huddled around the tiny, cracked screen. The footage was grainy, tinted with the sepia hue of age. It showed a group of hikers walking through the same dense timber they had just traversed. The sound was distorted, filled with static that pulsed like a heartbeat. Suddenly, the hikers on the screen stopped. They turned, looking toward an empty space between two pines. One hiker pointed a shaking finger. The camera panned, and there it was, a pale, motionless figure standing in the shadows, its limbs too long, its face a smooth, featureless surface. The hikers backed away, their movements frantic, but the camera never left the figure. Then, a sharp, metallic snap echoed from the device, and the screen turned to black. The forest around the current crew felt suddenly, aggressively cold. The last sliver of daylight vanished behind the canopy, and the forest did not just grow dark, it became opaque. Daniel struck a match, shielded it with his hands, and touched it to the dry brush.
The flame sputtered, flared for a heartbeat, and then went out as if snuffed by a phantom breath.
He tried again. The same result. They were left in a void, their flashlights cutting only short.
Trembling arcs into the oppressive gloom. Then the sound began. It was not the wind. It was the heavy,
rhythmic thud of something massive moving through the undergrowth. Thump. Pause. Thump. It started to their left, then drifted behind the tent, circling them with a predatory, calculated patience. Each step carried a weight that made the ground beneath their boots vibrate.
The crew stood back to back, their breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. Every time a flashlight beam swept the perimeter,
there was nothing but shifting shadows and the dense, vertical lines of tree trunks.
The footsteps grew louder, faster, closing the distance until the sound seemed to vibrate within their own chests.
The forest had become a cage, and the space between the trees was shrinking. The footsteps did not possess the irregular rhythm of a living creature. Each impact was identical, a heavy,
mechanical thud that defied the uneven, root-choked terrain. Ryan swung his flashlight toward the sound,
but the beam died less than 10 feet from his hand.
The darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical presence that swallowed the illumination, leaving them in a suffocating gray haze.
Emma stepped back, her boot catching on a jagged rock, and she nearly fell. "That is not a person,"
she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low, vibrating hum that now emanated from the soil itself.
Daniel gripped his flashlight, shaking it violently, but the bulb remained dead. The air grew thick,
tasting of ozone and wet, rotting earth. Every time the footsteps circled closer, the temperature plummeted,
frosting the air with their own exhaled breath. They stood in a tight, trembling cluster.
But the unity of the group was already fracturing. The forest was no longer just a place they were traversing. It was a sentient mechanism actively closing in around them,
feeding on their confusion and the rapidly failing light.
They were being measured, analyzed, and trapped by something that had no need for eyes to see them.
The pressure in the air reached a breaking point. A sharp snap echoed to their right, the sound of a heavy branch breaking under immense weight.
Lucas spun toward the noise, his face drained of color. Without a word, he plunged into the thicket, his boots tearing through the undergrowth. "Lucas, stop!" Daniel shouted, reaching out, but his hand grabbed only empty air. The sound of Lucas running grew distant.
Then, abruptly cut off into a suffocating, unnatural silence. The remaining three stood frozen,
their breathing ragged. Ryan stepped forward, his foot landing on something hard that skidded against a root. He knelt, his fingers brushing against cold plastic. It was Lucas's camera. The screen was still glowing, casting a faint, flickering light against the moss. Ryan clicked the playback button. The footage was shaky, blurred by violent movement, showing only the frantic blur of trees and the desperate, uneven cadence of footsteps. It was recording the path ahead, but there was no one in front of the lens. The camera tilted, capturing a final glimpse of a shadow shifting between the trunks before it hit the ground with a dull thud.
The forest had taken him, and the recording was all that remained.
Daniel grabbed the device from Ryan, his hand shaking as he replayed the clip. The audio was distorted,
crackling with static, but the words were unmistakable. It was his own voice, calling out from the speaker,
pleading for help from deeper within the tree line. Daniel froze, his skin turning ice cold.
He was standing right here, yet the device insisted he was 10 yards ahead, trapped in the gloom.
Ryan and Emma stared at him, their expressions shifting from confusion to a primal, unadulterated terror.
The forest was not just watching them, it was learning them. It was sampling their speech, their cadence, and their fears to craft a trap that could not be bypassed. The voice on the recording spoke again, a perfect, chilling replica of Daniel's own tone. It beckoned them to follow,
sounding desperate and entirely human. Daniel dropped the camera into the dirt, but the recording didn't stop.
It continued to loop, the voice repeating his own name with an eerie, rhythmic precision. The forest floor seemed to pulse,
the roots shifting beneath their feet, as if the earth itself were preparing to swallow the sound.
They were no longer hunting for answers. They were being hunted by their own reflections.
The loop of the recording ground on, the synthesized voice of Daniel echoing through the trees. Emma stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the impenetrable wall of darkness to the north. Then she tilted her head.
A faint, rhythmic sobbing drifted through the stagnant air. It was high-pitched, fragile, and undeniably human.
Emma took a step away from the center of their small circle. Daniel lunged, his fingers grazing her arm.
But she pulled away with a violent, unnatural strength. "It is her," Emma whispered,
her voice devoid of any recognition of her companions. She walked into the shadows. Daniel and Ryan shouted her name.
But the forest seemed to absorb the sound, muffling their cries before they traveled more than a few feet.
They scrambled after her, their flashlights cutting erratic, desperate arcs through the gloom. The sobbing grew louder, then abruptly shifted into a sharp, piercing wail that vibrated against their eardrums. Then came the sound, a single, blood-curdling scream that ripped through the canopy. It rose in pitch, choked on a sudden, wet impact, and vanished into total silence. The forest stood still. The crying stopped. Emma was gone, leaving nothing behind but the heavy, suffocating scent of wet earth and the absolute absence of movement. Daniel spun in a circle, his breath hitching in his throat. The flashlight beam caught nothing but tree trunks and the swirling mist. Ryan was slumped against a rotted log, his hands pressed hard against his ears, his mouth moving in a silent, frantic prayer. The scream had left a vacuum in the air, a heavy stillness that pressed against their skin like deep water. Daniel grabbed Ryan by the shoulder, shaking him, but the man didn't respond. He only stared into the dark, his eyes unfocused and wide. The forest seemed to lean in, the branches drooping lower as if the perimeter were tightening. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a voice calling them by name. Daniel tried to speak, but his voice came out as a dry, jagged rasp. He looked at the ground, searching for footprints, but the moss was undisturbed. There was no sign of Emma, no sign of the struggle, only the relentless, suffocating quiet. The paranoia set in like a fever. He looked at Ryan, then at the trees, then back at Ryan, wondering if the man beside him was still human, or just another layer of the deception. The reality of their isolation hit with the force of a physical blow. They were broken, alone, and the forest was waiting. Ryan stopped shaking. The transition was so sharp it made Daniel recoil. The man who had been curled in a ball of terror just seconds ago now stood up, his movements fluid and precise. He wiped the dirt from his face and looked directly into the dark. "I know this place, Daniel," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier tremor. Daniel stepped back, his flashlight beam trembling. "What are you talking about?" Ryan did not look at him. He stared at the trees as if welcoming an old friend. "I was here before, years ago. We came with gear, with cameras, just like this." He gestured to the surrounding woods with a slow, sweeping motion. "You think the forest takes us, that it hunts us?" Ryan finally turned, a faint, joyless smile touching his lips. "The forest does not need to hunt. It simply shows you the exit, and you choose to walk through it. It convinces you that your life is a burden you no longer need to carry." Daniel gripped his camera, his knuckles white, but Ryan stepped closer, his eyes reflecting no light. "It is a choice, Daniel. The whispers are not threats."
They are invitations. You only need to stop fighting, and the path will open for you.
The trees seemed to lean closer, listening to the words, as Ryan reached out a hand toward the deep, suffocating dark.
The air began to vibrate. It started as a low hum, a tectonic grinding deep beneath the volcanic soil, then rapidly spiked into a high-pitched, discordant shriek. It was not wind. It was thousands of voices,
layered and overlapping, merging into a singular, deafening roar that hammered against their eardrums.
Daniel clutched his head, dropping his camera to the dirt. The flashlight in his hand flickered.
The beam stuttering like a dying heart before it snapped into absolute blackness. Beside him,
Ryan stood motionless as the ground beneath them began to heave. Roots twisted upward, breaking the surface like fingers grasping for purchase. The density of the trees seemed to compress, the branches lashing out with rhythmic, metallic thuds. Every sense was overwhelmed by the noise and the sudden, suffocating dark.
Daniel swung his arms blindly, his hands brushing against bark that felt wet and pulsating.
The ground buckled, sending him stumbling into the undergrowth as the roar reached a crescendo, a wall of sound so dense it felt like a physical weight pinning him to the earth. There was no direction left, only the violent, churning chaos of the forest reclaiming its territory, turning every direction into a trap.
Daniel lunged forward, his lungs burning as he clawed through a wall of vines. He reached back, his fingers grasping for Ryan, but found only cold, damp bark. He pulled his hand away, the skin scraped raw.
He didn't look back. He couldn't. The roar of the forest had faded into a low,
mocking hum that seemed to follow him from every direction. He hit a patch of loose volcanic rock and skidded,
his knees slamming into the hard ground. He scrambled up, his palms slick with dirt, and sprinted into the void. Branches whipped across his face, leaving stinging welts. He ran until his legs felt like lead.
Driven by the instinct to reach the light. The trees were tighter here, pressing against his shoulders as he squeezed through narrow gaps. He tripped over a protruding root, fell, and kicked his way through the dense undergrowth. Every breath was a jagged intake of freezing air.
He saw a flicker of gray ahead, not the black of the forest, but the dull, muted light of the entrance. He shoved through a final
thicket of thorns, his chest heaving, and stumbled onto the hard, barren rock at the forest edge. He turned, gasping, but the path he had just carved through the trees had already closed behind him.
The silence at the mountain base was heavy, broken only by the sharp intake of Daniel's ragged breathing.
He lay on the volcanic gravel, his eyes fixed on the tree line that refused to yield any sign of the others.
When the search teams reached him hours later, they found a man stripped of his voice,
shivering against the cold. He pointed repeatedly at the canopy, but his fingers traced nothing but empty air.
The official report was issued weeks later. It was brief and clinical, citing acute disorientation and the treacherous nature of the volcanic terrain as the primary cause for the disappearance of the other three. It spoke of lost trails and shifting landmarks, treating the forest as a static,
physical puzzle. Yet the file remained open. Daniel sat in a quiet room, hearing the echoes of his team in every draft of air,
knowing the truth buried in the roots. The authorities closed the case,
satisfied with their logic, but the forest kept the evidence. Emma, Ryan, and Lucas were not merely lost. They were gone, consumed by a place that demanded absolute stillness. Daniel looked at his own hands,
still marked by the forest's touch, and realized that some truths were never meant to be recorded in ink. Months after the search was abandoned, the digital files underwent a frame-by-frame analysis.
Technicians scrubbed the noise, hoping to find a clue to the disappearance. They found something else.
In almost every shot, a pale, motionless figure stood at the periphery of the frame. It was present during the laughter,
the arguments, and the moments of silence. It did not move, yet it was always there,
watching the crew with a patient, unblinking focus. The team had never noticed it,
but the lens had recorded every second of the oversight. Then, the audio engineers isolated the final,
corrupted sound clip from the last camera. They filtered out the wind and the static. The room went cold as the voice emerged,
clear and detached, speaking directly into the microphone. You only leave when the forest forgets your name. The playback stopped. The technicians stared at the screen,
but the image of the forest had already flickered into a static haze. There were no more answers to be found.
The footage was archived, the files locked away, but the forest remained in the shadow of the mountain.
It waits in the dense timber, keeping its secrets buried deep within the roots, silent and eternal.